Hi, I'm going to be looking at three different pieces of art, and my purpose in this little audio thing is I want you to hear me analyze a piece of art. So when I'm analyzing art, I am not editorializing. You don't know if I like this piece or not. There's no information, there's no personal information. I'm just going using the elements and principles of design to talk about exactly what I'm seeing. So, it's the most beautiful piece, the piece sucks, none of that stuff matters. We're strictly analyzing art, so no editorial. So the first piece, we're going to look at three pieces. The first piece is the Reichstag, the wrapping of the Reichstag by Christo and Jean-Claude. The Reichstag is the German parliament. It has a long and interesting history. It was built in the early 1900s. It was before Germany, when Germany was united. It was the building that housed government for the entire country. Then World War II came. It became the headquarters for the Nazis. After World War II, when Germany was divided, the Reichstag was on the east side, so it was inaccessible to anybody other than the people in East Berlin and Eastern Germany. So Westerners could not go into the building. So in the 60s, in the mid 60s, Christo had this idea to cover a major important building, and he didn't have anything in mind, and his interest kind of fastened on the Reichstag because it was such an interesting building, and maybe because it was inaccessible. So in the mid 60s he had the idea, he started working on his initial drawings, and it took him until 1995, so 30 years before he could actually do it. He talked with I don't know how many presidents. He talked with various parliaments over the years, but he couldn't have access to the building because it was in East Berlin and he couldn't go over there. Also, he was a Bulgarian refugee, an illegal refugee, so there was a certain element of danger for him too. His fear was that he would be captured and deported. And of course, he wasn't interested in that happening. So that's a little background on the piece. So the first thing I do when I'm talking about a piece is I look at the piece. That's number one. You just look at the piece. You look at the size of the piece, the placement of the piece. You just look, and try and look at it without any distractions. So this is a huge building. It is wrapped in a silver synthetic fabric, fireproof. Obviously, the artist doesn't want to have imagine if the whole thing caught on fire. That would be a story. As always, Christo's pieces are paid for by himself, funded by the sale of drawings and talks and films and books and so forth. The pieces are up for 2 weeks, so it takes maybe a month to wrap it. It took, in this case, 30 years to get permission to wrap the building. And then for 2 weeks, it's there. 5 million people saw the piece live, approximately. And of course, it changes forever the way we look at that building and the way we think about that building. In Germany, with its, very difficult history, wasn't always so interested in being in the public eye, but they certainly were in this case. So again, we're looking at the piece and we're thinking about it visually. So I have in front of me the elements and principles of design, and I'm just going to kind of go down that list and see what's applicable. I say I have the list, but do I really? I do, maybe. Okay, so I'm going to think of it. Now, when we talk about the principles, you've learned about the principles, you've learned about the elements, and the principles, the elements support the principles. So if we say a piece has emphasis, we go, which is a principle of design, we look at the elements of design to see exactly how emphasis is achieved. Now, in a piece like this, okay, I'm going to go through the list and just sort of, speak about what I see. Repetition, it's gray cloth with a slight shimmer to it covering the whole building. So repetition doesn't really play here. Variety. The variety exists in the architecture itself. Now, Christo had a lot of choices when he wrapped this piece. How much detail did he want to show? And he wanted to show quite a lot. But still, just in terms of engineering, it's not like a fitted coat. It's, 100,000 square meters of fabric covering a big building. So there was only so much detail he could show on a piece this size. Balance, the piece is symmetrical. It's formal balance. Rhythm, there is a kind of a rhythm established in all the vertical lines through the folded cloths. Emphasis, it's in the landscape, it certainly is the thing to look at. He wanted, when he made the piece, he wanted a large area in front and around the piece so you could really see it and you could stand back from it. Because a piece like this, you can't get right up close to it. You won't see all the detail. You've got to stand back from it. Economy, you could say this piece is economical. We haven't talked much about economy, and I promise we will. Economy is when the artist uses the very least amount of elements and principles to say the most. So this piece, he chose silver, which he felt was sort of a dignified color, or neutral actually. He could have made it striped like a circus tent. He could have made it red. He could have made it red for the blood that was shed. I mean, a million things he could have done, but he didn't. He chose silver. He wanted a more dignified, neutral surface. So that was a very economical choice, I think. Proportion doesn't really apply because it's just not about that. And unity, it certainly is a unified piece because it's all covered with the same surface, which creates unity. So when you're looking at the piece, we have it's a horizontal piece. It hugs the ground, but it's also got vertical elements, the way the fabric's folded on it. Also, there are large vertical elements in the center on either side of the pediments and on the extreme right and extreme left of the piece. Although I would not say this piece is about being vertical, I would say it's really more about being horizontal. When you look at it, it's not like a towering Gothic cathedral that reaches up to heaven. It really hugs the landscape. In terms of the elements of design, line, there you could talk about the line, the horizontal lines that are created by the rope that's wrapped around the piece, and it changes the way the fabric reflects the light. There's also a lot of vertical lines in the way the fabric's folded. Now, space. I've talked about this in other places, and it's really important that you understand the idea of space here. With sculpture, space doesn't typically apply unless you're talking about negative space, something like that. But in a piece that actually exists in the world like sculpture does, that actually is three-dimensional, we can't apply the two-dimensional concepts of space, of flat, shallow, and deep, because it's not implied space the way it is on a 2D surface. We know there's no depth in a painting, it's flat, but we imply depth through various means. But in sculpture, we don't use that because it's real, it exists in space. Value, this piece is, the gray they chose, the silver they chose, on a scale of 1 through 10, 1 is white, 10 is black. I would say it's about a 3, although shadow creates some darker value, and it changes throughout the day. So depending on where the sun is, the shadows change, and also the way the silver reflects changes. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that in time, in actual real time, the piece changes. Shape, it is certainly a geometric shape. You could also call it a referential shape. And a referential shape is any shape that we recognize immediately. So we recognize this immediately as a large building. There's no question about what it is. It's not a spaceship. It's not a giant pumpkin. It's clearly a large building. Texture. Christo chose a shimmery, not glittery, not like a nightclub singer's dress or anything, but in the sun it has a slight shimmer to it. And he wanted that. He wanted the light to catch it and reflect in different ways. So texture is a part of it. Color is absolutely not a part of it. It's all about the neutral gray scale. So I think that's about it. The texture is real texture, obviously, because it's a real thing. It's not implied, it's real. So if I were writing about this piece, the first thing I would talk about, I'd name the artist, I'd name the size of the piece, the location of the piece, and I would include some history of the piece, because that's kind of the most, for me, that's really the most important thing, is that it took 30 years to create this piece. That's quite a long time. And then I would go through the principles and elements of design. When you're writing your papers, when you're critiquing the work, it's important to really be logical and orderly when you're doing it. I would always start with an outline, first look, then create an outline. And when you're talking about the work, if something doesn't apply, like color doesn't apply, you don't need to say this piece is not about color. That's obvious. Just talk about what's there rather than what isn't there. I think that's all I have to say. We're going to move on to the next piece. The next piece we're looking at is Pink Tulip by Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe painted this in 1926, and the piece is 36 inches by 30 inches. So it's a pretty, it's not small, but it's certainly not a large piece. Georgia O'Keeffe went through a couple of different periods. She did a lot of florals, and one of the interesting things about her florals was the way she kind of zoomed right in on them. She rarely stepped back from the flower. She often just zoomed in, and painted the part that was the most interesting to her. She had a great way with color. She had a great way with form. And so we're going to review this piece in terms of elements and principles and see what we see. So when writing the paper, the first thing we do is write down the sort of the statistics of what it's made of and when it was made. And you know, when I'm writing about a paper, of course I'll look in the art history book and see what the art historians have to say, but I want you to be wary too. When they start editorializing and saying what stuff means, really take it with a grain of salt, because it's what it means to them. And again, we're not interested in that kind of editorial. We're interested in just what we see. There's two ways I look at art. If I'm looking at art as an academic, I apply the elements and principles of design. I don't think about, do I like it, do I not like it. I just look and analyze. When I'm looking at art, you know, for my home, or I'm just at a show and I'm not in my teacher mode, then I can respond emotionally, and I like it or I don't like it, and I don't think about why I like it or don't like it. I just do or don't. But in this context, we're being analytical. So a lot of times in history books and art appreciation books, the authors tend to get a little too personal. So ignore that, because it's just what somebody's thinking about today, and the next edition they'll be thinking something different. So it's not the gospel, it's just one person's opinion, which essentially means nothing. Or, you know, your opinion is just as valuable. So anyway, there's the rant. So in terms of, so the first thing we do when we're looking at artwork before we analyze is we look. And after we've had a good look, if you want to, you know, go on Wikipedia and read about it, or Google it. That's what I usually do when I'm thinking about a piece, is I Google it and just see what comes up. So I'm not looking at everything that comes up as the gospel truth. I'm just looking to see what's being said about it and maybe some history of the piece. But that doesn't actually affect what we see. What we see is what we see. So here, let's talk about what we see. The first principle I'm going to look at is repetition. There is repetition in this piece. There's the flow of the pink, the light red lines. I'm going to call them light red because that's their color. And there's the flow of the green lines that represent the leaves. So there's repetition in sort of the organic lines that are moving through the composition. Also, I'm aware that the composition is kind of divided on the diagonal, the difference between the pink flower, the light red flower, and the different shades of green leaf happens at a diagonal, which is kind of interesting because it's a bucolic image. It's a flower and a leaf. It's a kind of a, people often call her work feminine for various reasons, but a diagonal line through the composition creates interesting tension. So I find that interesting that she's doing those two things. And here's a word that I haven't used a lot, but that I love: juxtaposition. Two things put together that you don't expect. And in this case, we don't expect something as calm and peaceful as a floral to have diagonal lines in it. And yet she does. She did that. Okay, variety. There is variety in color. There's variety in line. There are vertical lines and there are diagonal lines. Rhythm, I think the repetition of those fields of color create a kind of a rhythm. The balance is clearly informal. If you divided the piece in half, what's on the right is not on the left. Emphasis. Emphasis, I think she creates here with value. Remember, anytime we talk about emphasis, we don't just say what the emphasis is. We talk about why the emphasis is. And we use usually the elements of design to talk about that. So in this case, it looks to me like the little, I'm not sure if this is the correct term, the pistil of the flower that's right in the center of the piece is a dark green and almost the darkest value. Remember, we can talk about the color green, but then there's the value of the green, and it's a pretty dark value, light to dark, it's pretty dark. It's in the center of the piece, so placement has something to do with it. Value has something to do with it because it's darker than everything around it. And also, it's a vertical line. All the other lines are kind of flowy and curvy, but this is pretty much a vertical, well, it's a shape slash line. So it's kind of erect amidst all these other forms. So I would say that emphasis happens because of placement, value, and the way that line is positioned, or the shape is positioned. The shapes are very organic. They're all flowing life form shapes. And economy, this is not an economical piece. It's pretty lush. She's got a lot of different colors. She's using a lot of range of values, and she's right up close to the piece. She's got your face right in this tulip. So it's not an economical piece. I would consider it pretty lush. Proportion scale. So we don't really know what the proportion is because it's not next to anything. There's not some tiny man or some, big hand or something that gives us something to contrast. But she does zoom in on the piece. So that's something to talk about, that she chose for the piece to really overwhelm the canvas, for the piece to be about the interior of the flower, or the close-up of the flower, rather than the flower in a context, the flower on a table in a living room or that sort of thing. She didn't do that. She really zoomed in, so it's about the flower, nothing but the flower, so help me God. Unity, I think the piece has unity because of the rhythm of the lines, the rhythm of the repetition of the color, the pink, 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 or light red, light red, light red. And the way she sort of divided the canvas diagonally also creates a kind of unity. Let's look at the elements. In terms of space, I would say this is shallow space. We don't have any real sense of deep space. There's no blue sky in the background going forever and ever, or ocean. You might say, well, there's a little bit of blue on the right, maybe that would imply, but it's not jumping out at you. And if it's not jumping out at you, assume shallow. We know it's not flat because there's overlapping. The leaf is overlapping the petals, the various interior parts of the flower are overlapping the exterior parts of the flower. So even though it's shallow space is what it is. Line, the artist is definitely using line. The line is a soft line that's moving from the center of the flower up to the top of the canvas and to each side as well. And then the line of the leaf. There's a repetition of the exterior line of the leaf in the center part of the leaf, and then the other exterior line. Texture, we know this is implied texture, right? It's not real texture. If we put our hand on it, it would be a flat, smooth surface, or relatively. Value, the artist does not use a huge range of value, but she does use value to create emphasis. And she also uses a darker value on that leaf, that interior section of the leaf. It almost looks like a pod. And in fact, I'm not even going to talk about the sexual implications in O'Keeffe's work because I haven't read enough about her or read anything she said about that to take that as truth. A lot of people say her work is sexual, but I don't know. Unless the artist says it, I'm not ready to talk about it. Color, the artist is using light red, which is red with white, so that's still red. Doesn't change color because she's changed the value. She's using green, a couple of different shades of green, so red and green are complementary colors in terms of color analysis, which typically are super, super contrasty. But because she's used so much white to make them lighter versions of themselves, it does create contrast, but not the crazy contrast one would expect because she's used such heavy neutrals to soften up those colors. So it's interesting again, like she used that diagonal in this peaceful painting, she also used complementary colors, which is an interesting choice. The shapes are organic shapes, and again, as you're analyzing the piece, do an outline, try and be orderly about it, and talk about what's there and not what isn't. And again, no editorializing. All right, I'm going to go on to the next piece. This piece is by Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer. It's called Woman Holding a Balance. It's an oil painting, oil on canvas. And this piece is in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., so our country owns this piece. At any time, you could go to D.C. and see this piece, which would be amazing. It was painted either in 1662 or 1663. The piece is 16 3/4 inches by 15 inches, which is a tiny little piece. But you look at the quality of the painting that Vermeer does, and it's quite detailed. So painting a large-scale piece when you paint at this level of detail would take quite some time. So we're looking at the composition. Just in terms of general description, we see a woman on the right-hand side, bathed in the beautiful light from the window. Vermeer was very well known for his use of light, and in this case, whenever we talk about light and darkness, we're talking about value. Behind her is a painting by Michelangelo called The Last Judgment, and that's in the Sistine Chapel. It's a fresco in the Sistine Chapel, so it's kind of interesting that Vermeer reproduced it in his portrait. The woman is pregnant. She has in front of her, she's holding a scale, but there's nothing on the scale. And in front of her, we see fine cloth, a beautiful rich cloth, some kind of satin maybe, and an open jewelry box spilling over with jewels. Many people have written many things about what this piece means. Is she a Madonna figure, the pregnant woman bathed in holy light, or is she some wanton who knows what, surrounding herself with earthly goods? And in the background, the painting of The Last Judgment which is a pretty serious painting about the end of the world and the judgment that falls on mankind. So unless Vermeer tells us what it's about, we don't know. We can only guess. And, your guess is as good as any art historian's. Vermeer is using color okay, I'm just going to go through the list now, so I'm organized as well. Repetition. This piece does not have a lot of repetition in it. Variety, it does have a lot of variety. There's beautiful surfaces of cloth, there's jewelry, there's a painting in the background, there's the beautiful light that's coming in on the figure, so there is a variety. Rhythm, I would say not so much about that. Balance, it's informal balance. The figure of the woman is on the right-hand side, and the jewels and the cloth and the source of the light are on the left-hand side, and that creates the balance. The emphasis, now the piece is called Woman Holding a Balance. And you can barely see the balance. What you see is the woman bathed in light. You see the reflection of her white headgear and the scarf around her neck. I didn't realize she was pregnant the first time I saw the piece because I couldn't stop looking at her face and the front of her chest in that beautiful luminous light. That's certainly the focal point. And it's the focal point not so much because of placement, because it's off to the side. It's the focal point because of value. Now, the white is a luminous white. There's no other white that bright in the piece. So the artist is using value. We see where the light comes from, but it's not nearly as rich at the source from the window as it is reflecting on the woman. Economy, it's not an economical piece. It's a lush, lovely piece full of beautiful texture and surface and complicated background. I mean, he could have had a plain wall, but instead he chose to reproduce a Michelangelo. That's pretty bold. Proportion and scale, this piece is not about proportion and scale unless you talk about the small scale of the scale and the fact that the scale is so small and barely visible, which is kind of interesting. Unity, I would say the piece has unity. That's always a difficult one. I always assume every piece has unity. But maybe that's a foolish assumption. But this piece feels finished to me. The elements seem to be working together. It looks like a cohesive composition. So in terms of space, this is clearly shallow space because we see the wall in the background. We see where the room ends. Line. This piece does have some interesting line quality in it. There's implied line. You see the woman's gaze as she looks to her hand. It creates implied line because where she looks, we look. That may be the only reason we look at her hand is because she's looking at her hand. So the artist uses implied line to move our eye around the canvas. Texture, the piece has implied texture because if we ran our hand over it, it would be smooth. But there is a lot of implied texture. The folds in her skirt, the ruffle around her face, the rich satin cloth, the pearls gleaming, the wooden box, the light coming in through the window. It's very much about beautiful texture, and Vermeer is a master at painting texture. Value, absolutely, no question. The artist uses value to create emphasis. The artist uses value to move our eye around the canvas. So value, absolutely. And he uses the entire range. He goes from the darkest dark to the lightest light. A lot of times in a canvas, the artists stay away from the really light ranges. But in this case, he's used all the entire range of the gray value, and really effectively. It's a moody piece. It's very dark and has an interesting mood to it. And in no small part because of the darkness of the composition, the darkness of the room. Color, the artist is using some rich blues, which were very expensive at the time. Paint, you didn't go buy it in the tubes the way you do now. You mixed it, and the oxides were oftentimes ground elements that were very expensive. And they would mix it with the oil base to create the paint. So Vermeer was not a wealthy man by any means, but he certainly didn't hesitate to spend money on his material. So the piece is not about color the way it is about value, but the artist does use some really rich, elegant color. And then shape, the shapes are organic. It's a human form and some geometric in the background for the frame. But generally, I would say this has organic shape since the focal point is the female figure. She's pregnant. The emphasis is on her. All right, so I hope this has been helpful as you move into the part of the class where you're critiquing work, where you're where you're analyzing work. You remember to look, see what's there, describe what you see, and then analyze it in terms of elements and principles. All righty, thanks.